So I was up on my roof last Saturday, replacing some damaged shingles when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. I looked down and saw my dad's silver Lexus, S350 parked behind my Ford F150, blocking me in completely. Dad got out first, straightening his expensive suit jacket. Then, my brother Jonah climbed out of the passenger side wearing what looked like a brand new outfit from head to toe. Both of them were dressed like they were heading to some important business meeting, which immediately put me on edge because they never just show up at my place unannounced, especially not looking like they stepped out of a magazine. I should probably give you some background here because this situation has been building for years. My dad, Philip, has always treated Jonah like his golden child, while treating me like some backup plan he never wanted to use. When we were kids, Jonah got the brand new Trek mountain bike while I got his beat-up hand-me-down. Dad paid for Jonah's entire college degree, covering everything, while I had to take out massive student loans. When Jonah graduated, Dad helped him with a $20,000 down payment on his downtown condo. When I graduated with my construction management degree, drowning in debt, I got a handshake and a lecture about personal responsibility. Jonah got family connections for his first job, while I started from the bottom working construction crews. The breaking point happened 4 years ago, when my grandmother died. She left her Victorian house to both of us equally, worth about $300,000. But Dad convinced me to sign my half over to Jonah for his business venture, promising they'd pay me back once it took off. That venture became a beach house rental property that's made them over $500,000, and I never saw a penny. But here's what they don't know. I've spent 4 years building my own success specifically to be ready when they came crawling back. I built a construction business with 12 employees and contracts across 3 counties, bought this house with cash so they couldn't touch it, and most importantly, learned exactly how their rental empire works. I know they use coastal property management for bookings. Their mortgage is through First National, with climbing rates, and they've been cutting corners on maintenance using unlicensed contractors. I've been building relationships with people in their business network who'd be very interested in certain information about how they operate, especially regarding tax reporting and safety violations. So when Dad started yelling up at me from the driveway, I wasn't surprised at all. I was ready. He demanded that I get down there immediately because they needed to discuss something urgent and important. The way he said it, with that same commanding tone he'd used when I was 15, made me want to finish the entire roof replacement just to make them wait in my driveway. But I climbed down anyway because I was genuinely curious what they wanted badly enough to drive 40 minutes to my place on a Saturday morning. The second my feet hit the ground, Jonah launched into his familiar routine about how I needed to step up as a brother and help family when they needed support most. He started pacing around my driveway like he owned the place, gesturing wildly and talking about family loyalty and obligations like he was giving some motivational speech. Then, Dad pulled out this thick manila folder full of official-looking legal papers and started waving it around dramatically, telling me this was my absolute final chance to do the right thing or face serious consequences that would permanently change my relationship with the family. Here's where the whole situation gets absolutely ridiculous. Turns out Jonah is getting married next month to this woman Charlotte, who apparently has extremely expensive taste and zero concept of living within a budget. They're planning some massive destination beach wedding at a resort in the Outer Banks, with 150 guests flying in from all over the country. The wedding venue alone costs $18,000, and that's before you factor in the catering, the open bar, the photographer, the live band, the flowers, and all the other luxury touches Charlotte insisted on having. They've already put down deposits on everything and signed contracts that lock them into the full amounts. The problem is they're short on funds to actually pay for it all, not just a little short like needing a few $1,000s. They need $45,000 in cash within the next 3 weeks or the whole elaborate wedding gets canceled and they lose every penny they've already put down. Dad explained the situation like he was presenting a business proposal. They'd already taken out a second mortgage on the rental property to cover what they could, but the bank wouldn't approve them for any additional credit. Jonah's been living beyond his means for years, buying expensive clothes, dining out constantly, and taking weekend trips, so his credit score is completely shot. His debt-to-income ratio is so bad that no legitimate lender will touch him. They need cash immediately. And according to Dad, I'm their only option because I'm the only family member with liquid assets and good credit. He kept talking about how this was my chance to finally contribute something meaningful to the family and prove that I understood what family loyalty really meant. Here's where it gets really good, though. Dad informed me that if I don't come up with the money, they're going to file papers to have me officially disowned from the family. He kept waving these documents around, claiming they were legitimate legal papers that would cut me out of any future inheritance and remove me from all family records. Jonah chimed in saying that after the disownment, none of them would acknowledge my existence anymore. My future nephew wouldn't even know my name. And they'd destroy every photo that had me in it. The whole time they're talking, I'm just standing there listening to them lay out their demands like I'm supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to fund my brother's wedding. Dad kept saying this was my last chance to prove I'm really part of this family, and Jonah kept talking about how I owe them because of everything they've done for me over the years. What really got me was when Dad stepped closer and asked what it was going to be, the money or exile from the family. Like those were my only two options and I should be scared of losing them. That's when I pulled out my phone and showed them one text message I'd received earlier that day. I held the screen where they could both see it clearly. Dad's hands started shaking the second he read it. He asked who I'd sent that message to, but his voice was completely different now. Jonah grabbed my phone to get a better look and just started screaming. I mean, full-on panic screaming. The neighbors came out to see what was happening, and by the time everything calmed down, both my dad and brother were sitting on my porch steps looking like their entire world had just collapsed. But I'm not telling you what that text said yet, because what happened next is going to blow your mind. Update 1. Holy hell, you guys! The response to my first post was insane. Some of you were asking what that text message said, and trust me, you're going to love this. But first, let me tell you what happened after they both stopped screaming on my porch. So there I was, watching my dad and brother sitting on my steps looking like their world just ended. When Dad finally managed to pull himself together enough to start talking, he kept asking who had sent me that message and what I planned to do with the information. The desperation in his voice was something I'd never heard before, and honestly, it felt pretty damn good after 4 years of them treating me like garbage. The text message was from someone named Marcus, who works for the county building inspection department. You see, while I was learning everything about their rental property business over the past 4 years, I discovered they'd been cutting some seriously dangerous corners to maximize their profits. They've been advertising their beach house as sleeping 12 people in their rental listings, but they never got permits for the additional bedrooms they built in the basement and converted attic space. They've been renting to large groups and families for years without proper fire exits, adequate electrical capacity, or safety equipment that meets current building codes. Marcus had texted me that morning to confirm he'd received my comprehensive 40-page report about the safety violations, along with detailed photos and documentation of all the unpermitted additions I'd discovered. He was planning to conduct a surprise inspection the following Monday morning, and if he found everything I'd reported, they'd be looking at massive fines starting at $25,000, immediate closure of the rental operation, and potentially criminal charges for knowingly endangering tenants over multiple years. But here's where it gets really good. And I mean really good. When I showed them that text message, Dad immediately started trying to negotiate with me like his life depended on it. He said they could work something out, that maybe they didn't need the full $45,000 for the wedding, that perhaps we could find some middle ground that would work for everyone. Jonah jumped in desperately, saying they could postpone the wedding until next year, scale back all the expensive details Charlotte had insisted on, find ways to make it work without needing my money at all. The panic in their voices was absolutely incredible. These were the same two men who had driven to my house an hour earlier, acting like they owned the world and threatening to disown me if I didn't hand over my life savings. Now they were practically begging me to reconsider, offering to compromise on everything they'd said was non-negotiable. I just stood there listening to them backtrack on everything they'd said about disowning me and cutting me out of the family. Suddenly, I was their beloved son and brother again, and they were talking about how families should stick together and help each other through difficult times. The same family loyalty they'd been threatening to revoke 10 minutes earlier. That's when I decided to let them know just how thoroughly and methodically I'd been preparing for this exact moment. I told them about the other detailed reports I'd filed with different county departments over the past several weeks. The comprehensive complaint with the tax assessor's office documenting how they'd been fraudulently claiming the beach property as their primary residence to get homestead exemption while simultaneously running it as a full-time commercial rental operation. The Environmental Health Department complained about the septic system that's been illegally modified and expanded to handle more people than it was originally designed for, creating potential groundwater contamination issues. I explained how I'd spent months systematically documenting every single building code violation, every tax discrepancy, every safety hazard, every permit violation I could find. I had hundreds of photos taken over multiple visits, copies of receipts for unpermitted work, rental agreements showing overcrowding, guest reviews mentioning safety concerns, and everything needed to prove they'd been knowingly operating an illegal and dangerous business for years, while pocketing hundreds of thousands in unreported income. Dad tried desperately to argue that I was being vindictive and that none of this would actually stick because they had expensive lawyers and important connections throughout the county. He claimed the county officials were probably friends of his from his business dealings and wouldn't take serious action against a respected local business owner who contributed to the community. Jonah chimed in saying I was just bitter and jealous about Grandma's house and trying to destroy their legitimate success out of petty resentment over something that happened years ago. That's when I realized they still didn't understand how completely screwed they were, so I pulled out my phone again and showed them another message that had come in during our conversation. This one was from their property management company, Coastal Property Management, informing me that they'd received copies of all the county reports I'd filed and were immediately suspending their business relationship with my dad and Jonah, pending the outcome of the investigations. No more bookings, no more management services, no more rental income starting that very day. You should have seen their faces when they realized I hadn't just filed complaints with random county departments hoping something would stick. I'd made absolutely sure their business partners and professional contacts knew exactly what kind of illegal operation they were associated with. The property management company couldn't risk their reputation, their licenses, and their relationships with other property owners by continuing to work with people who were under active investigation for safety violations and tax fraud. They'd cut ties immediately to protect themselves. Jonah completely lost his mind at that point, and I mean completely. He started yelling about how I was destroying his wedding, his future with Charlotte, his whole life and career over some stupid family disagreement from years ago. He said I was being petty and vindictive, that a real brother would never try to hurt family like this over money. Dad joined in, his voice getting higher and more desperate, saying I was making a huge mistake that would tear our family apart permanently and leave me with nothing but regret for the rest of my life. But I wasn't even close to being done yet. I told them about the third part of my comprehensive plan, the one that was going to hit them where it would really destroy them financially. See, when you own rental property, especially property you're using for commercial purposes, you need multiple types of insurance coverage: property insurance, liability insurance, business insurance, umbrella policies. And insurance companies really don't like it when they find out you've been systematically misrepresenting your property usage and operating without proper permits for years. I'd sent detailed reports to their insurance carrier documenting absolutely everything I'd discovered. The unpermitted additions, the overcrowding violations, the safety hazards, the fact that they'd been claiming it was a personal vacation home when it was really a full-time commercial operation generating substantial income. Their insurance was almost certainly going to be canceled within days. And good luck finding another company willing to cover a property with that kind of extensive violation history and active county investigations. Without insurance coverage, they couldn't legally rent the property to anyone. Without rental income, they couldn't make the substantial mortgage payments on either of their properties. Without the management company handling everything, they had no way to book new guests, coordinate cleanings, handle maintenance issues, or manage any of the day-to-day logistics of running the business themselves. I'd systematically destroyed every single aspect of their entire operation in one perfectly coordinated attack that they never saw coming. Dad kept trying to reason with me, explaining that if I destroyed their business, I'd be hurting myself too, because I was supposedly part of the family. He reminded me that they'd always planned to include me in their success eventually, that the beach house could have been something we all benefited from if I'd just been patient. Jonah took a different approach, getting angry and demanding to know how I'd gotten access to all their private business information. He accused me of probably breaking into their house or hacking their computers to get the documents I'd used in my reports. When I reminded him that most of the information was publicly available through county records and that I'd gotten the rest through my legitimate business connections, he just got more frustrated. The really beautiful part was watching them realize that every relationship I'd built over the past 4 years, every connection I'd made in the construction and property management industry, had been preparation for this moment. The building inspector who'd agreed to fast-track my complaint, I'd done renovation work on his house. The tax assessor who'd flagged their homestead exemption. My company had worked on several county projects and built a reputation for honesty and quality work. They'd spent 4 years thinking I was just some struggling contractor who'd never amount to anything, while I was actually building the network and reputation I'd need to destroy them when the time came. Every job I'd taken, every relationship I'd cultivated, every favor I'd earned, had been invested toward this moment. But the conversation was far from over, and what happened next is when things got really interesting. Because Dad finally admitted something I'd been waiting 4 years to hear, and it changed everything about how I understood our family dynamic. Update 2. You guys, I'm still processing what happened yesterday. The comments on my last update were incredible. So many of you called exactly what was coming next. But I don't think anyone could have predicted what my dad actually confessed to. This is going to be long because there's so much to unpack. So after I explained about the insurance reports and watching them realize their entire business was about to collapse, Dad got this look on his face that I'd never seen before. Not anger, not panic, something closer to defeat. He sat there on my porch steps for what felt like forever, just staring at the ground while Jonah kept pacing around my driveway, muttering about how we could fix this if we all just worked together. Finally, Dad looked up at me and said something that completely floored me and explained so much about our family dynamic. He told me that none of this was ever supposed to happen the way it did, that when Grandma left the house to both of us, he'd genuinely planned to include me in the business from the very beginning. But then Jonah had come to him privately just days after the funeral and convinced him that I wasn't mature enough to handle that kind of financial responsibility, that I'd probably mess up the whole operation if I was involved as an equal partner. According to Dad, Jonah had spent weeks systematically undermining my credibility and arguing that the rental business was too complicated for someone without formal business education or experience. Jonah had apparently painted this detailed picture of me as someone who would want immediate gratification rather than building something sustainable long-term, someone who couldn't be trusted with major financial decisions or complex business relationships. But here's the part that really got me and made everything click into place. Dad admitted that Jonah had also told him I'd been talking privately about how much I resented them both, how I felt like the family had never truly supported me, and how I was planning to move away and cut all contact once I got my inheritance money. Dad said Jonah convinced him that I didn't really want to be part of the family business anyway, that I was just looking for a way to cash out quickly and disappear from their lives permanently. Jonah had apparently told Dad that I'd been complaining about how the family always put business before relationships and that I thought they were all too focused on money and success. According to my brother's version of events, I'd said multiple times that I wanted nothing to do with their business ventures and just wanted my fair share so I could start fresh somewhere else without any family obligations. I stood there listening to this and realizing that Jonah had systematically manipulated Dad into cutting me out by telling him exactly what he wanted to hear. Dad had always been worried that I wasn't as committed to the family as Jonah was, and my brother had exploited those insecurities to get what he wanted. The favoritism I'd experienced my whole life wasn't just preference for Jonah. It was Dad believing that I didn't want to be part of their world anyway. Jonah tried to interrupt and deny everything, claiming Dad was misremembering or misinterpreting what he'd said years ago. He insisted he'd always wanted me included in the business and that they'd been planning to bring me in once everything was more established. But Dad kept talking, and it became clear that this wasn't some confused recollection. This was him finally admitting to being manipulated by his golden child. The conversation turned into this absolutely brutal back and forth between them, with Dad accusing Jonah of systematically lying to him about my intentions and character for years, and Jonah desperately trying to reframe everything as innocent misunderstandings and miscommunications that had been blown out of proportion. It was fascinating watching them turn on each other when the pressure got intense enough. 4 years of partnership in screwing me over, and now they were ready to throw each other under the bus to save themselves from the consequences. What really struck me was how quickly their unified front collapsed once their individual survival was threatened. Dad started talking about how he'd had doubts over the years about whether they'd done the right thing, how he'd sometimes wondered if Jonah had exaggerated my negative attitudes. Jonah fired back that Dad had been just as eager to exclude me from the business, that he'd made the final decision and couldn't blame everything on manipulation now that it was convenient. But while they were arguing about ancient history, I was getting more texts about how my current plan was unfolding. The county building inspector had moved up his timeline and was planning to visit the property that afternoon, instead of waiting until Monday. Apparently, my report had raised enough red flags that they wanted to document everything before the owners had time to make any emergency repairs or modifications. When I mentioned this to them, both Dad and Jonah immediately started begging me to call Marcus and delay the inspection. They promised they could fix whatever violations I'd reported, that they'd get proper permits for everything, that they'd make the property completely legal if I just gave them time. Dad offered to pay me back the full value of my inheritance from Grandma's house, plus interest, if I would just make one phone call to postpone the inspection. Jonah got even more desperate, offering to cancel the wedding entirely and use all the money they'd saved to pay me back instead. He said Charlotte would understand, that they could have a small ceremony later when their finances were more stable. He kept talking about how this was all just a big misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand and how we could work everything out if we just communicated better. I told them it was way too late for any of that. The building inspector was already on his way. The insurance company had already opened their investigation, and the tax assessor was already reviewing their homestead exemption status. Even if I wanted to stop what I'd set in motion, which I absolutely didn't, there was no way to call back all the different agencies and departments I'd contacted. That's when they started getting really creative with their desperation. Dad suggested we could claim that I'd filed all the reports based on outdated information, that they'd actually gotten proper permits recently, but there had been some kind of administrative delay in updating the records. Jonah proposed that we could say I'd been confused about which property the violations applied to, that maybe I'd accidentally reported problems with a different rental house. The fact that they thought I would help them commit what amounted to fraud with multiple county agencies just showed how completely they'd lost touch with reality. They were so used to manipulating situations to their advantage that they couldn't understand why I wouldn't just go along with whatever scheme they cooked up to save themselves. But then Dad's phone started ringing, and everything got so much worse for them, so much faster. It was Marcus calling to let them know he was currently standing in their rental property documenting safety violations, and he had some questions about the unpermitted bedrooms he'd found. Dad put the call on speaker, and I got to listen to Marcus describe exactly what he was seeing. Electrical work that wasn't up to code, fire exits that had been blocked by furniture, smoke detectors that weren't properly installed. You could hear the resignation in Dad's voice as he tried to explain to Marcus that they'd been meaning to get proper permits, that they hadn't realized how serious the violations were, that they'd fix everything immediately if he could just give them some time. Marcus wasn't interested in excuses. He explained that the property would be red tagged immediately, meaning no one could legally occupy it until all violations were corrected and proper inspections were completed. The red tag meant their current guests would have to be evacuated immediately. They'd have to refund money for upcoming reservations, and they couldn't rent to anyone new until everything was fixed. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars in lost revenue during what should be their busiest season, plus whatever it would cost to actually bring everything up to code with proper permits and licensed contractors. Jonah completely melted down during that phone call. He started screaming at Marcus about how this was destroying their livelihood, how they had a right to due process, how the county couldn't just shut down their business without giving them a chance to explain. Marcus calmly explained that endangering public safety wasn't a matter for negotiation, and that they should consider themselves lucky. He wasn't recommending criminal charges for knowingly renting unsafe accommodations. After Marcus hung up, both Dad and Jonah turned to me with this look of pure hatred that I'd never seen before. All the earlier pleading and negotiating was gone, replaced by raw anger about what I'd done to them. Dad told me I'd destroyed not just their business, but their entire family, that there was no coming back from this level of betrayal. Jonah said I'd ruined his life and his future with Charlotte and that he'd never forgive me for what I'd taken away from him. I reminded them that all I'd done was report violations that they'd created themselves. I hadn't forced them to build unpermitted additions, to lie on their insurance applications, or to commit tax fraud with the homestead exemption. I'd just made sure the right people knew about the illegal things they'd chosen to do. But honestly, watching them blame me for the consequences of their own actions just confirmed that I'd made the right choice. These weren't people who were sorry for what they'd done to me. They were only sorry they'd gotten caught. And what happened next proved they were willing to get even more desperate to try to save themselves. Final update. This is it, guys. The final chapter of this absolute disaster of a family situation. I honestly didn't think it could get any more intense after everything that happened in my last update, but these people proved me wrong in ways I never could have imagined. Get comfortable because this is going to be a long one. So after Marcus hung up from red tagging their property and Dad and Jonah finished blaming each other for manipulating the situation years ago, things got quiet for maybe 10 minutes. Both of them were just sitting on my porch steps looking completely defeated, while I stood there watching their entire world crumble in real time. But then Jonah's phone started buzzing with text messages, and that's when everything went completely off the rails. The messages were from Charlotte, and apparently she'd been getting calls from their wedding vendors. The catering company wanted final payment by Friday or they'd cancel. The venue needed the remaining balance within 48 hours or they'd release the date. The photographer was asking about timeline changes because other clients wanted their slot. Jonah was reading these messages with increasing panic, realizing their wedding was about to collapse within days. Charlotte had been trying to handle everything while Jonah was at my house, but she couldn't give vendors answers about payments. That's when Dad made what might have been the most desperate decision I've ever witnessed. He announced that he was going to take out a personal loan against his own house to cover the wedding costs and the immediate business expenses. Not just the down payment on his house that he'd mentioned before, but a complete second mortgage that would put his primary residence at risk if they couldn't make the payments. Jonah immediately started arguing against this plan, saying Dad was being crazy and reckless, that they couldn't risk losing the family home over a wedding. But Dad was insistent that they could make it work if they just had enough cash to get through the next few months while they fixed all the property violations and got the rental business running again. I pointed out that even if they somehow managed to bring the beach house up to code and get all the proper permits, they still had to deal with the insurance cancellation and the tax fraud investigation. Their homestead exemption was definitely going to be revoked, which meant thousands of dollars in back taxes and penalties they'd have to pay immediately. The insurance company wasn't just going to reinstate their coverage after discovering they'd been lying about property usage for years. Dad kept arguing they could handle these problems if they had working capital. He talked about hiring lawyers, getting contractor quotes, shopping for new insurance. He made it sound like a temporary setback they could overcome with money and determination. But while he was laying out this elaborate recovery plan, I was getting more texts that completely undermined everything he was saying. The insurance company had officially canceled their coverage effective immediately, and they wanted the property evacuated until it was brought up to code. The tax assessor had calculated they owed $47,000 in back taxes and penalties for the fraudulent homestead exemption. The county had imposed additional fines for operating an illegal commercial business in a residential zone. When I shared these updates with them, you could literally watch Dad's recovery plan falling apart in real time. The numbers he was talking about just kept getting bigger and bigger, until it became obvious that even mortgaging his house wouldn't generate enough cash to cover everything they owed. We were looking at well over $100,000 in immediate costs, plus whatever it would take to actually fix all the building violations. Jonah started spiraling, talking about how Charlotte would leave him if they canceled the wedding, how his future was ruined, how he'd never show his face in their social circle again. He said Charlotte had been planning this for over a year, that her family had flown in from 3 states, that canceling would destroy their relationship. That's when Dad dropped another bombshell that I absolutely wasn't expecting. He admitted that they'd already been struggling financially even before my reports triggered all these investigations. The rental business hadn't been as profitable as they'd claimed because they'd been having to constantly pay for emergency repairs and deal with guest complaints about safety issues. They'd been basically breaking even for the past year while living off credit cards and personal loans. The expensive wedding had been their attempt to project success and stability that they didn't actually have. Jonah had convinced Charlotte that they were doing so well with the business that they could afford a luxury celebration, but in reality, they'd been planning to use the rental income from this summer to pay for everything. With the property shut down during their busiest season, there was literally no way to generate the money they needed. I stood there realizing my revenge had been more devastating than planned. I'd thought I was destroying a successful business, but I'd actually exposed how close to collapse they already were. The violations and tax fraud had just pushed them over the edge they'd been teetering on for months. But even facing complete financial ruin, they weren't ready to give up. Dad started talking about selling the beach house as quickly as possible, even at a loss, just to get enough cash to cover their immediate debts. Jonah suggested they could downgrade the wedding to something much smaller and less expensive, maybe have it at someone's house instead of the resort venue. I reminded them that they couldn't sell a property that was red-tagged for safety violations. No bank would approve a mortgage for a buyer when the house couldn't legally be occupied. They'd have to fix everything first, which would cost tens of thousands of dollars they didn't have, before they could even think about putting it on the market. And honestly, the idea of them having any kind of wedding celebration while owing massive amounts in back taxes and penalties just seemed completely insane to me. They were talking about spending money they didn't have on a party while their entire financial foundation was collapsing around them. That's when the conversation took its final turn, and both of them made one last desperate attempt to somehow salvage the situation. Dad offered to sign over his half of the beach house to me completely, giving me full ownership if I would just help them pay the immediate debts and keep them from losing everything. Jonah said he'd do whatever I wanted, apologize publicly, acknowledge that he'd been wrong about everything, if I would just help them get through this crisis. The thing that really got me was how they framed these offers like they were doing me some kind of favor. Dad acted like giving me full ownership of a property that was legally uninhabitable and owed massive amounts in fines was some generous gift. Jonah seemed to think that a public apology would somehow make up for 4 years of lies and manipulation. I told them both that it was way too late for any of that. Even if I wanted to help them, which I absolutely didn't, I wasn't going to throw my own money into their sinking ship just to watch them make the same mistakes again. They'd proven that they couldn't be trusted with business decisions, financial planning, or basic honesty about their situation. The last thing Jonah said to me before they finally left was that I'd destroyed not just their business, but any chance of our family ever being whole again. He said that even if they somehow recovered from this financial disaster, they'd never be able to forgive me for what I'd done to them. Dad echoed the same sentiment, telling me that I'd chosen revenge over family and would have to live with that choice for the rest of my life. I watched them drive away in that expensive Lexus that they probably couldn't afford anymore, and honestly, I felt nothing but satisfaction. 4 years of planning had led to this moment, and it had worked even better than I'd hoped. They'd lost their business, their financial security, their social standing, and their ability to manipulate situations to their advantage. The best part is that everything that happened to them was a direct result of their own choices and actions. I didn't frame them for anything or make up false accusations. I just made sure the right people knew about the illegal and dangerous things they'd been doing for years. They destroyed themselves. I just lit the match that exposed how flammable their whole operation was. As for what happens next, I honestly don't care. Maybe they'll find a way to dig themselves out of this hole, though I seriously doubt it. Maybe Charlotte will dump Jonah when she realizes what a financial disaster he's become. Maybe Dad will lose his house when he can't make the payments on that second mortgage he was talking about. What I know for sure is that they'll never again be in a position to manipulate and steal from family members. They'll never again be able to act like they're successful business people when they're really just cutting corners and breaking rules. And they'll definitely never again underestimate what I'm capable of when someone crosses me. To everyone who followed this story and cheered me on through all 4 updates, thank you. Your support meant everything during what was honestly the most satisfying week of my adult life. Sometimes the good guys really do win, and sometimes revenge really is a dish best served cold.